All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tunç Shen. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of History and the Deputy Director of the Sabanci Center for Turkish Studies here at Columbia University. We are very lucky to have Professor Mert from Sabanci University, Istanbul, Turkey. Our center has an agreement with Sabanci University every academic year. One of the Sabanci University faculty comes here and gives a talk. And Professor Moral is with us this semester. We're so happy to have him here. Let me briefly introduce him before I give the floor to Professor Moral. Professor Moral is an associate professor of political science and international relations at Sabanci University. He received his PhD in 2017 in political science at the State University of New York at Binghamton University. And the same year he joined the Sabanci University. His research interests are voting behavior, political participation, democratic representation, polarization, political and survey methodology, and comparative and Turkish politics. Professor Moral's research has been published in several prestigious journals, including American Journal of Political Science, Political Analysis, Political Behavior, Electoral Studies, Party Politics, and Political Research Quarterly. Professor Moral has recently received several awards, grants, fellowships, and honors, including the Sakıp Sabancı International Research Award in 2022, TÜBİTAK 1001 program, TÜBİTAK as the highest research council in Turkey. And Professor Moral also received the Outstanding Young Scientist Awards of the Turkish Academy of Sciences and Science Academy. He's also the co-principal investigator of the Turkish election studies and Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality Mayoral Election Survey in 2019. So please join me in welcoming Professor Mert.
Thank you very much for the kind and generous introduction, and my apologies for forcing you all to be here today. It's actually an unfortunate time both for Columbia University and me as a guest. I need to be around here this time. Hopefully today I will make a presentation that might be intriguing for some of you who are interested in Turkey, Turkish politics, or electoral behavior in general. So this is the title of an article that we submitted for publication consideration for a special issue on Turkish elections in May 2023 that I co-authored with Professor Berkesen from Sabancı University. In this co-authored project, I am actually working with Professor Emre Erdoğan from Istanbul Bilgi University and a PhD student of mine, Şeyma Topçu. This actually builds on almost a decade-long research I have been working on since 2014-15. Actually, it started as a dissertation chapter when I was still a graduate student. And with every election, we actually collected new data, and the more we collected, actually the better, more strong, more robust the findings have become. The gist is basically I'm trying to understand whether the high and growing polarization in Turkey, and I'm going to show you a couple of graphs that basically show that Turkey is actually a poster child of the polarization literature, comparative party politics, comparative electoral behavior literatures, both underline the fact that Turkey's polarization has actually reached to unprecedented levels, and you living in the US would simply ask, okay, how about that compared to the US? And I'm going to show you a graph that is hopefully going to intrigue you, showing that Turkey's polarization actually is higher than that in the US. So we don't know where it ends, so I can anticipate the question, okay, how to reverse such polarization? We have no idea. How to basically impede electors from polarizing even further? I don't know that, but I know and what I'm going to show today is basically polarization affects not only party strategies, not only parties' policy-taking incentives, but also electoral behavior. And in this study, as I said, and as Tunç Hocam kindly mentioned, I'm a co-principal investigator of the Turkish election study with Professor Sersin Kalaycıoğlu, Professor Çarpol, and Professor Erdem Aytaç from Koç University. And I'm going to employ post and pre-election surveys from 2011, 2015 June and 2015 November elections, 2018 June elections, and 2023 May elections. Aside from this question, trying to answer that, this study is trying to also contribute to not only the Turkish politics literature, but also the comparative politics literature, because it is, to the best of my knowledge, the first study that actually focuses on what we call issue voting in Turkey. It actually tries to underline whether individuals' distinct policy preferences, more specifically economy, is affected by their their non-policy considerations, such as their partisanship. It is also the first study today that actually focuses on investigates the interactive effects of two sorts of polarization, two components, both the party and the electoral polarization. It also tries to examine the interactive effects of ideological and affective polarization, so both policy and non-policy considerations of voters that I argue in this paper have long been polarized and have been increasingly polarized in the last decade. And while doing so, I will focus on not only the short-term election-specific factors, but also the long-term factors that are mostly related to the party system in Turkey. So, my goal is to model the change in Turkish voters' choice set composition. This is a relatively new concept. I'm going to explain in the upcoming slides what I mean by concentration set or choice set. But the argument here is that individuals, because of the increase in polarization, they actually are effectively more polarized, which means affective polarization is a combination of two things. We know partisanship, right? We know positive partisanship. I mean, from decades-long research on partisanship, starting in the US, then basically being studied elsewhere, right? In almost all other countries. That is how affectionate you are towards your own party, towards the party that you support. That we call positive partisanship. On the other hand, new research, relatively new research, actually underlines a second component of affective polarization, that is negative partisanship. So not only you are affectionate towards your own party, the party that you like, but it sometimes reaches to a level of hatred towards the other party and other parties' fellow partisans. That basically leads to a zero-sum game in politics, which I argue in this paper that actually decreases individuals' choice set size, which is the number of candidates or the number of parties that individuals consider to vote for in the first place. That actually has important consequences when it comes to our understanding of what an ideal democracy is. Because according to the normative ideal, right, I mean, individuals should cast informed votes, right? That engaged citizenry, taking into account both parties' policy offerings and individuals' preferences, would require an engaged citizen to actually look for the party that presents them the best option, right? Providing them with the best policy solutions for their most important problem or for the problems that they care about, policy problems. On the other hand, I argue, because of this decreasing size of the choice set, individuals actually listen to only the parties that they support or a few other parties, which in turn makes us drift away from that ideal, that normative ideal of engaged citizens. So I'm going to show you a couple of graphs in the upcoming slides that simply show that in Turkey, partisan and policy polarization has actually reached to a level that we haven't seen before. While doing so, as I said, I'm going to employ the Turkish election study data from 2011 to 2023. I would like to highlight one thing. I know public opinion polls, both in the US, in many other countries, and in Turkey, have not been respected. So this is not public opinion data. This is basically I wouldn't use the word equivalent, but comparable to the American National Election Study, and it is actually part of the comparative study of electoral systems. We have been actually a member of the comparative study of electoral systems, and the data that you can download freely actually come from the Turkish election studies, post-election components. So I am going to actually present you findings relying on scientific surveys. I will also rely on an estimator. I'm not going to get into details. If there are questions, I would be more than happy to do so during the Q&A. It is a novel-ish random effects estimator that myself and my co-author Andres actually developed in 2018. It's called constraint choice conditional logistic regression, and it specifically allows us to actually take into account that decrease in the choice set composition that I mentioned as a function of individuals' policy and non-policy considerations, which we argue in this paper are affected by both increasing and high levels of party and electoral polarization. So I like to actually show the findings in advance so that you would, the audience actually would know what to look for. The findings suggest a considerable level of heterogeneity in individuals' choice sets. And the weights that Turkish voters assign to ideology and examine policy domains, and I examine, if I'm not mistaken, 6 here. Their weights actually have differed over the course of the period that I examined in the last decade. Parties, I argue, strategically take more extreme stance. And in a paper that got published in 2023, my apologies for the wrong citation, that I co-authored with Robin Best from Binghamton University, actually asks this chicken and egg question. Is party polarization or does party polarization cause electoral polarization, or does electoral polarization cause party polarization? And in this paper, examining advanced democracies, 19 advanced democracies between 1971 and 2022, we actually found with Robin that it is actually the party polarization that causes electoral polarization. That is against the representation relationship that we have all learned about democracy, right? So representatives should actually respond to the demands of the representative. But if representatives can actually make the represented actually demand for something that they already offer, this is actually what we observe with the relationship between public opinion and party policies, then we have a problem. And since my dissertation, I have been arguing that it is actually the party's fault that we observe today in the US, today in Turkey, today in many other democracies, that both the parties and the electorates keep increasing, growing in their polarization levels. So what happens if party polarization is high and growing, as in the case of Turkey? I argue it actually leads to more and more loyal constituencies who actually do not defect from their partisan choices. That in turn leads to much lower levels of volatility and increasingly bipolar party systems, as we observe in the US between the Republicans and the Democrats, and we observe in Turkey between the Nations and the People's Alliance since at least 2007. That I call a bipolar electorate, which was actually the title of my dissertation as well. So before getting to the actual paper, this is from another paper that I co-authored with the same PhD student of mine, Şeyma Topçu. In this one, we are not examining Turkey, but 21 democracies. Most of them are basically advanced democracies in Western Europe. And here we ask a simple question. We ask whether individuals' level of effective polarization, it's an observational study relying on survey data, so we do not basically argue for a causal relationship, but mostly a correlational one. We simply actually ask whether effective polarization has a direct and an indirect effect on individuals' likelihood to stay loyal to their party or to switch to the incumbent or the opposition. And the findings actually suggest that those who are effectively more polarized are much more likely to stay loyal to their own party, that is, to not defect, and much less likely to actually switch either to the government or the opposition. That is the direct effect of effective polarization. But there is also an indirect effect, which I found more important. So, if you are familiar with the empirical Turkish electoral behavior literature, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that. Most of those studies actually are focused on a particular strand in the literature, that's economic, both in theory. And given the last election, right, the most important question that a lot of people, pundits, experts, even political scientists have asked is, okay, what happened? Right, despite all that, fuss about the, deteriorating economic conditions in the country, the earthquake, right? The lack of relief efforts, lack of rescue attempts. Ali Çarkoğlu, actually on NTV on the election night, he basically described that as a perfect storm. I mean, those of you who actually watched Twister would actually understand the analogy. I mean, so basically the surrounding conditions were so favorable for the opposition, and everybody was shocked that actually Kılıçdaroğlu, the opposition's candidate, lost both the first and the second rounds. So, and the most important argument for those who were expecting an opposition win in May 2023 was that economy was really bad. I will actually, I have data that I can share with you. I mean, those should be in the appendix if I'm not mistaken. That simply shows that 4/5 of the Turkish electorate actually said economy was the most important problem, according to them, in the 12 months preceding the election. But this graph actually shows that economic voting theory doesn't work. So, according to the economic theory of voting, right, or economic voting theory, individuals who believe that economy had gotten much better in the 12 months in the last year preceding the election should vote for the incumbent. If they think that the economy had gotten much worse, right, then they actually switch to the opposition. This part actually shows that that expectation, decades-long research on economic theory, only works for this part of the electorate. Those are the effectively non-polarized citizens. For effectively polarized citizens, basically the propensity to vote for the incumbent or the opposition is simply the same. It is statistically indistinguishable. That means people who are effectively polarized do not take into account the economy when they vote. So, Süleyman Demirel's very famous saying actually only applies to effectively less polarized individuals. And remember, Turkey is not part of that sample. This sample is composed of 22 countries, 26 election studies, and mostly advanced democracies. So, I told you, I mean, Turkey is a good case to study the effect of polarization. The reason is, differently from all those advanced democracies, you see 19 of them here, okay? Turkey is this red one. I was hoping to actually zoom in. I know it is actually hard to see from a distance, but I mean, that you would see, I mean, distinguishably, right? The red line actually shows much higher levels of polarization than all other 19 countries. Let me read them, what they are. The blue one is the US, for your comparison. The others are Australia, Austria, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, the usual suspects, right? So in the advanced democracies, we actually see in some of them increasing polarization over the course, but not to the level of Turkey. So Turkey actually is showing much higher levels of polarization, regardless of whatever measure that you use, except for this one. This is the effective number of parties. That is basically the number of parties that can change the policy. This is Sugar Tantaga-Perez's famous measure. And you see, Turkey's party system, like the US, is quite stable, which means the reason for polarization is not new parties, is not the extreme right, as in the case of many established democracies in Europe. But what we observe here is that the same parties that have been in the party system since 1999 have been polarized. And these data actually are aggregated data coming from 190 different post-election surveys, coming from 20 countries. 19 of them are established democracies, as well as Turkish elections. Okay, what happens if I look at a larger number of countries? Here you see 59, and I'm looking at the CSCS data that covers all the post-election studies in those between 1996 and 2023. And you see Turkey's party polarization. This basically corresponds to the 2015 November elections. It was much higher back then, and Turkey was actually the highest in Turkey when it comes to party polarization as of November 2015. And the dot actually shows the last election, that is May 2023 election. So we didn't upload the Turkish election study data to CSCS yet. It will be part of the module 6, which will be released in the upcoming months. So I basically put that together in order to show you the trend. And if you take a look at the US party polarization is not very high. But there are a couple of countries that actually show higher levels of party polarization than Turkey, Hungary and Sweden to be specific. When you look at electoral polarization, as of this election, Turkey actually is the 5th from the top out of 59 countries and 226 post-election surveys. US is also high, but not super high. Where they actually are the highest is effective polarization. Remember, effective polarization was a combination of both positive and negative partisanship. And when you reach to this level, you made the capital. When you reach to this level, we don't know what happens next. So in a country that actually shows the highest level of effective polarization, the next question to ask is, okay, what is unique when it comes to the electoral behavior in Turkey, showing such high levels of effective polarization? So I'm going to show you, and I told you that electoral polarization is not super high, and I'm going to show you the evolution of electoral polarization when we divide the electorates, Turkish voters, based on their vote choices. Okay, this is not their, reported party allegiances. This is basically their reported vote choices. And here, I basically divided the Kurdish nationalist voters, HDP. In earlier elections it was DEHAP, right? Then it became Yeşil Sol, the Green Left, CHP, İYİ, which only appears in 2018 and 2023, AKP, and MHP. These were the four major parties. In addition to non-voters, who you see are located at around the median, right? At around the midpoint of that scale, as in the case of many countries, those are usually not non-voters only, but also non-ideologues, who are not interested in politics. What I would like to show you is this region. So when I presented this graph, I'm going to confess, I presented that more than 10 times so far. Every time I present this, the underlying, I'll say, conclusion, okay, that is already set in people's mind is, okay, the parties should appeal to the middle, right? This is the downstream middle water theorem. The problem is, this is E party, the X marks E party, and X actually is closest to the middle water. It is closest to the midpoint of the scale. It is closest to the center of that party system. And E party's vote share is only 10%. The reason is, with parties, as you see, AKP actually moved farther away from the center. As you see, CHP is more or less at the same position as in the case of Democrats and Republicans, right? Democrats stay at around the same position, since 1988. However, Republicans drift away from the center. With that, as you can see, voters of AKP around here, right, clustered around here, actually moved slowly to the right. And now, since 2015, we actually have two poles, one to the extreme left and one to the extreme right, that now correspond to the two alliances. And you see actually AKP's distribution and MHP's distribution almost fully overlapped since 2015. So we are actually talking about a quiet, homogeneous ideological base for Cumhuriyet Party of People's Alliance. Another thing to note is the center just vanished. So there are not many floating voters in Turkey, which actually provides descriptive support for my argument that volatility due to this growing and high polarization should decrease slowly. Okay, that was the electorate's polarization. And we know individuals become more extreme in their ideological preferences. They also become more extreme in their policy preferences, which are more and more congruent with their ideological preferences. And parties also change their policy stance over the course of time. Here you see a graph that actually shows a couple of things. The first four parties that I told you, Nationalist Action Party, Republican People's Party, HDP or Yeşil Sol Party, as of May 2023, Green Left, and Justice and Development Party, AKP, are the ones, right? Starting with June 2011, we actually asked individuals to place not only themselves, but also the parties on 6 different policy domains, and we kept 4 of them the same over the course of the last 13 years. So we can now trace how individuals perceive the parties moving away from the center. And what is interesting to me is the most extreme party as of 2011 for many voters was Adalet and Kalkınma Partisi, right? However, right now it is HDP, and the least extreme is the Good Party. So you would expect the Good Party appealing to a larger number of voters, but what I argue, because of this effective polarization, right, E Party can only appeal to 10% of the electorate. So that project, right, appealing to the centrist, appealing to the middle voter, actually was born that, right? Another thing is HDP, right, Yeşil Sol Party, actually became way too extreme for a lot of voters as of 2018, but not so as of 2023. The reason is the electorate themselves, right? They are also moving to the left. So we are talking about the electorates of the opposition alliance, the table of six. So I'm not going to bore you with the theoretical expectations a lot, but just so you know, there are like two strands in the literature. These are the special theories of Hawthorne. Going all the way back to Downs, the Downsian proximity, spatial theory, and the directional theory. These are the two major spatial theories of issue voting. They both predict that non-centrist voters, as in the case of Turkey, have higher utilities from voting for candidates with polarized stance. So if both the parties and the voters are polarized, right, we expect the polarized voters to actually vote at higher levels for polarized parties or candidates. However, these utilities are conditional on individuals' considerations of available choices. So voting for the AKP or CHP candidate, as in the case of the May 2023 elections, right, should be conditional, I argue, on individuals' other attitudes other than policy, non-policy attitudes. So even if an individual is closer to Erdogan's policies, okay, if he's not a or she's not a AKP partisan, then I argue they don't even listen to them. So they would still vote for the best party or the best candidate, not based on the policy offerings of that party or candidate, but because of their positive and negative partisanship. So these are the assumptions that I make, which are all supported in this paper and in other papers of mine. With empirical data, we should actually expect to observe higher polarization as a function of party polarization. It actually leads to higher perceived polarization by respondents. It also strengthens individuals' partisan attachments. There is research that basically finds that in the US as well. Shanto Yangar has been publishing about that since 2011. Elena Bromwitz since 2010. This is I'll say kind of conflicting because one group in the literature argues that higher polarization should lead to higher ideological voting because ideology and party labels become synonymous. Another group simply argues that higher polarization should lead to higher issue voting instead. Why? Because now individuals' partisan attachments are shaped based on their issue preferences, and the findings are mixed, to be perfectly honest. That is the contribution of this study. It simply argues that there will be a much smaller number of alternatives that individuals consider. Regarding this consideration set, there's a special issue that got published in Electoral Studies, the top subfield journal, that simply basically provides evidence from different contexts about that individuals' choices are not constant. Which is super important because all those models actually rely on conditional logistic regression, which actually brought McFadden a Nobel Prize in 2009, that rely on the single assumption that everybody have the same fixed choice set. When you relax that assumption, however, you actually reach very different conclusions. And that special issue specifically deals with that and simply shows evidence from different contexts, as I said, that individuals' choice sets are different. Another effect of polarization that I haven't mentioned so far is that polarization actually mobilizes individuals to turn out in the first place. So when polarization is high, there is more to lose, there is a higher stake in the elections for you, and you are more likely to turn out. So I'm teaching electoral behavior at Sabanci since 2017, and after the last elections, after the defeat of the opposition, most of my, in the American terms, liberal students were basically shocked. And most of them said, I will never vote again. What I told them in response is, wait until March 2024, you will sing, the most pro-opposition songs, and you will go to that ballot box. I was right in the sense that 80% of the country actually did so. There was a 4% increase, but if you actually look at the turnout levels in Turkey, you see a constant increase, as in the case of the US since 1988. There was literature that simply argues that this is an American phenomenon thanks to the two-party system. People actually have a higher stake in elections, and with polarization, they do turn out more. In 2017, I actually examined advanced democracies in Europe with proportional representation, which means a larger menu of party policy options. And I actually showed that in these systems, there's actually a centrist party like E-Party. And because of that, that alienation of the voters when the other parties move away from the center doesn't take place. And because of that, it should actually be higher in party systems with proportional representation, and the empirical evidence actually suggests that. So in Turkey, if you actually take a look at all the presidential elections, there's not much I know since 2014, right? Or all the parliamentary elections since 2002, you actually see an increasing trend in electoral polarization, an increasing trend in party polarization, and an increasing trend in voter turnout. However, the weak partisans may become more alienated. We actually may or may not, I don't know that. I'm still waiting for the data, but we may have actually seen some indication of that in the last municipality elections. So what I mean by constellation set is this. In a polarized party system like Turkey, every single leader is angry, every single leader is shouting, every single leader is insulting the others, every single leader is actually using a very negative tone, right, in their discourse. But sometimes, I always give my mom as an example, and she hates that. But my mom says, if you actually cut my wrist, I will never vote for you. The reason is, she actually doesn't see all those four candidates. She doesn't consider all of them. She considers only the two. And when she makes a choice, she's not making a choice from among those four. She actually makes a choice from among those two. And that I call a limited, a constrained consideration set. If you will only choose from among those two, why would you pay the high cost of informing yourself about the policy preferences of the others? Why would you actually listen to somebody who you will never vote for? Why would you even pay that price of going to that ballot, right, if these two are off the ballot? And that consideration set, I argue, is basically shaped by exogenous factors, right, that are shaped much earlier than these elections. The long-term factors that basically shape your identity, your group identity, your party. I'm going to skip the math behind that, and I will get to that. So for this presentation, these are the double-barreled policy preference questions that we are using. So, when we were actually, I was a grad student when we designed them in 2011. I was an assistant to Professor Charcoal, and we actually spent a lot of time going over the party manifestos for the June 2011 elections in order to actually figure out the most important policy domains that basically sparked the, most amount of debate among the parties in order to figure out what could be the most important policies for individuals. That was before we even started collecting data. Then we actually found that most of those policy domains actually worked as expected. We tried them in a pilot test, in a pre-test, and these are basically, this is the main dimension of competition in Turkey, right? I mean, a secular party on the left, CHP, versus a pro-Islam party on the right. So that question was worded such that, would you actually prefer secular policies at the expense of individual freedoms? That basically refers to the headscarf issue at the time. The other one is basically an issue that actually bothers the Kurdish nationalists. Would you actually favor fighting against terrorism at the expense of civil liberties? That's basically the Turkish nationalists versus Kurdish nationalists. That was a very important debate. We actually introduced that question before 2017 referendum. That is basically the regime type presidential versus the parliamentary. That was very important in 2013. This is when we introduced that, June 2015. That is fight against corruption versus the stability in the government. So that basically the AKP officials were accused of corruption. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, December 25, 2013. However, their argument was that, okay, there might be some glitches, right? But we should stay in power, and we should stay in power in order to sustain government stability, from the instability of which, right, actually, Turkey has suffered a lot during the 1990s. And the last one, we actually introduced the integration of the immigrants or sending them back, which was a very important issue for this last parliamentary elections, which actually showed us an important rise in the electoral support for the far-right Zafer Partisi victory party. And of course, we also introduced the rescale left-right scales. Electoral viability of the parties is also measured, which is kind of interesting and important in Turkey because of the now 7 but previously 10% nationwide electoral threshold. So many CHP voters actually, we know, tend to vote for HDP so that HDP could actually pass the 10% nationwide threshold and get their representatives elected from Eastern and Southeastern Turkey, so that CHP's partisans, most disliked party, AKP, would actually get lower number of MPs. This is like super sophisticated tactical voting that I'm describing here, and I'm not talking about a few voters here, I'm talking about roughly 2 to 3% of the electorate. So how do I measure electoral viability? I basically measure that by taking into account the vote share of a particular party in a given district in the previous election and dividing it so that in order to actually measure how many more votes that particular party needs in order to bypass either the nationwide threshold or the district threshold. I showed you these policy extremity scores. I basically created an individual region of acceptability. That is an important but understudied phenomenon in the literature on electoral behavior. Individual's region of acceptability is super important because some individuals are right-wing, but they will never vote for the extreme right. So they have a certain region of acceptability that basically excludes far-right parties, for instance. Or some individuals are right-wing, but they will never vote for a center-right party that is basically outside of their region of acceptability. How do I measure that? By taking into account, by calculating individuals' own extremity score and parties' extremity score, and taking a look at it. And lastly, I introduced affective polarization. So these are basically the variables in a separate equation that you see here, but not see, that basically would show me whether individuals' consideration sets are larger or smaller as a function of these variables. I also account for several socioeconomic factors, sociodemographic factors, my apologies, urban-rural divide in Turkey, religiosity, Kurdish versus Turkish ethnicity, income levels, and economic satisfaction. Skipping that, and here is what I found. So that actually shows you the change in the choice set size between June, November 2015 elections and June 2018. I know it's hard to see that, but what I'm trying to show is this. There were a lot of voters who only considered a single party in June 2015. No other party but their vote. So roughly 2/3 of the electorate would never consider voting for any party. Then there came the alliances. Now, a lot of voters actually are between two parties, a large party like AKP and a smaller alliance party like National Action Party, MHP. However, what you also see is that the tail of that distribution actually disappeared altogether. So there are fewer and fewer voters who consider all parties. So I'll show you a better graph coming from this election study. I basically divided voters based on their predicted probability of including all those alternatives and created what I call effective number of parties or candidates in their own choice set. So I'm not asking individuals to basically tell me, would you consider voting for this party? I'm basically measuring this latent probability of including that party by relying on all those variables that I told you, right? Including effective polarization. And what you see is, when I take a look at their effective polarization scores, I basically divided them into two distinct groups, called them polarized and unpolarized. Take a look at the number of candidates that polarized voters actually see. They don't consider the other candidates at all. They only consider a single candidate. If you look at the effectively non-polarized voters, however, you see here, for instance, a normal-like distribution, right? That basically has a mode of 2, but a median of 3 parties. So individuals actually think of other parties, research about those parties, consider voting for those parties, unless they're effectively polarized. So what does it mean? In Turkey, ideology is a significant determinant of voting behavior, and we should expect that because right now ideology, group identity, your partisan identity, they all become synonymous. As in the case of US, right? Liberal and Democrat mean the same thing right now. Still, some policies seem to affect electoral behavior. For instance, the fight against terrorism in November 2015 elections, as you would remember, right? There were basically within cities, there were basically, militarized disputes, right? I mean, between the terrorists and Turkish armed forces, parliamentarism versus presidentialism, as in the 2018 election, and immigration in this election. Some policies still do matter, but again, only for effectively non-polarized voters. Electoral viability is no longer an important concern, possibly because of that the nationwide threshold was decreased from 10 to 7%. In 2017. Perceived ideological and policy polarization is a significant determinant of choice set composition, but its substantive effect doesn't seem to decrease over time. This is important. So people right now do not perceive more polarization than they used to. So that's a good thing. They are just more polarized. Parties are more polarized, but they are not perceiving parties becoming more and more. However, partisan strength and partisan effect, their effects on the choice set composition keep increasing. That means people care less about policy, even ideology, but more about their group identity when they go to the elections. That basically makes Turkey drift away from the democratic ideal. It basically makes Turkey not a unique case because the US is very similar to that, and I can show you a graph if you want, but a very bad example for the democratic ideal in terms of that engaged citizenry is not anymore in Turkey. So, regarding the effects of party, ideological, and effective polarization, we now see policy preferences are less important, ideological and partisan attitudes are more and more important. We see stronger partisans, and remember, individuals become stronger and stronger partisans over time. They consider fewer and fewer alternatives, if not a single candidate or an alliance. And we see overlapping ideological and policy preferences of the alliance parties and increasingly similar preferences of their supporters have decreased vote transitions between the two camps, but increase them within the camps. So when you see MHP increasing its vote share, it's not because they're actually stealing voters from the other camp. It is because they're stealing voters from it. As we actually observed in this last mayoral election, right, between the New Welfare Party, or Welfare Again, right, and the AKP partisans, for instance. That will be all. Thank you very much for this.
Please. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Morel. The floor is open for questions, so please take any question. I mean, I have several questions out of ignorance. I don't want to dominate the discussion here, but one thing I'm curious is your data sets. I mean, it relies particularly on the parliamentary / presidential elections, but it doesn't include mayoral elections. Is there any reason?
Yes, we actually don't do Turkish election studies for the mayoral elections. We did one, but it was with a different group for the I'll say, repeated mayoral elections in 2019. But the dynamics are different. And to be perfectly honest, these are like super expensive studies, as you would know from the American National Election Study. And getting funding for social science research isn't easier in Turkey. So basically, we do not collect individual level pre and post election survey data for the mayoral elections. Hence, I actually need to rely on aggregate level data at the expense of falling into the ecological fallacy trap in order to make those conclusions regarding the electoral behavior.
If you had a chance to include those results from mayoral elections, would you anticipate a difference in terms of polarization?
I can show you a graph. So I know this is super small, but what it shows is this. Here you see the Istanbul's 961 neighborhoods. Again, I'm telling you, these basically suffer from ecological fallacy, but Istanbul's 961 neighborhoods in the, this is basically the distribution of the no votes in the April 2017 referendum. And here, you basically see Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's vote share in the second round of the presidential elections on May 28, 2023. And the correlation between them at the neighborhood level, adjusting for different neighborhood sizes, is never less than 0.982. So I argue the reason for that is geographical polarization. But geographical polarization, however you name it, is a function of people moving to places, right? I mean, where like-minded people live, or people from similar backgrounds live, or people who share their, ideological preferences live. And that actually shows a very high level of correlation. Despite that, we are practically examining 7 years of elections, right? I mean, how many of them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elections. This is a lot. So, I mean, this correlation cannot be explained, we argue, by something else, but people's very stable and unchanging policy and party allegiances. I don't know if that answers your question.
To me, the graph that was so striking was the one earlier about the economy in the last 12 months and how that affected people's voting. So in America in 1992, James Carville, who was Bill Clinton's campaign manager, said it's the economy stupid. So if he was here today, he'd have to revise his statement and say it's the economy stupid, but only for those non-polarized voters, which you said was a sliver of the electorate in Turkey, like 10%?
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I don't think it is even that much. I mean, my calculations show it's like 6.5% on perfect ones.
Wow.
Who can switch votes?
Wow.
So we can now more correctly predict electoral choices than ever, both in the US and in Turkey. And the reason is, you would remember seeing those graphs on news media, right? I mean, maybe newspapers, maybe like Financial Times, showing that Democrats' perceptions about economy change literally on the election night when Biden gets elected. Right? I mean, when Trump was in power, they say economy was deteriorating, right? I mean, literally 2 days afterwards, Pew data showed that it is right now reversed. Now Republicans think the economy is very bad, but Democrats think vice versa. So, I mean, it's not me. It is basically a lot of people studying electoral polarization simply argue that, right? Political polarization is like a pair of glasses. When you actually put that on, now you see the world outside from the lens of your partisan identity. So, unfortunately, for polarized people, the economy doesn't work as much. And I can show you for the US that it is not like 1992 anymore.
Can I see that? Of course. Thank you.
This is somewhat of a different graph than you would expect to see. Let me explain what it is. It's kind of complex and it's coming from a different paper. So 1992 is here. And you see some individuals here and some individuals here. But also some individuals here. So the ones that are in the middle are what we call the floating or swing voters. So those are equally likely to include the Democratic president and the Republican president and abstention, not voting, right, in their choice. But when you move from 1984 to 2020, you see that grayish part disappeared, and about like 32% of the electorate is literally here, which means they are not considering non-voting and voting for the other candidate, but the Democratic candidate, and about like 32% is here, that is not considering the Democratic candidate at all and not considering no turnout at all. So these are the ones who turn out right now, which basically shows that if they don't care about the other party's candidate at all, it's probably not the policy based on which they actually make their vote decisions. So, and I account for economic considerations here, which also lost their significance over the course of the 40 years of data that I have been examining.
In the United States, the political parties had bigger tents years ago. Michael Harrington famously said the Democratic Party is a liberal party with a conservative fringe, while the Republican Party is a conservative party with some liberal. So if he was still alive today, he'd say that's not true anymore. Does that account for some of this? That there's so few voters willing to look at data objectively and make up their mind? Does that account for any of that? And how does that compare to Turkey would be my second question.
Maybe. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I like to talk based on my own findings, and I haven't studied that. But my hunch, I mean, let's say educated guess, is that the partisan identity right now, right? It's not the tweedledee-tweedledum stuff. It is not when that Committee on Political Parties of the American Political Science Association wrote that responsible party thesis report, right? Right now, parties are clearly distinguishable in the eyes of many voters, right? I mean, everybody knows what a liberal, which one is the Liberal Party and which one is the Conservative Party. Right, and then when they actually perceive, when they are asked how they would place the parties on different policies, they more clearly and more easily can look at which party is the pro-abortion and which party is the anti-abortion, right? Or which party is the pro-choice or not, or which party is the pro-climate change or global warming or not. So they actually even can tell you, right? I mean, the exact words that parties use to describe particular phenomena, such as climate change. So that, to me, actually says that with increasing party polarization, parties can successfully distinguish themselves from their opponents, and that is perceived equally well by their partisans. Regarding Turkey, the situation is kind of different because we have been discussing that back and forth with Ideological, with Charcoal, I mean, all those big names, I mean, in Turkish politics literature. They argue, and I agree to a certain extent, that, I mean, the partisan identity in Turkey is not as stable as it is in the US. And the reason is the party system is not as established, right? I mean, AKP is a current party, I would say a quite new party, which was founded in 2001, if I'm not mistaken. EU Party was founded as a splinter party in 2018, right? So then your allegiance to a party that is only like 6 years old shouldn't be as strong to a party that has been there for like almost centuries, right? So when you compare Turkish and the American party systems, I agree with them that the allegiance is probably to a party family in Turkey rather than a particular member of that party family. But still, we actually observe that in the sense that despite being a new party, there are a lot of people who are members of the party and who simply tell you that not only them, but their fathers and mothers, I mean, who were basically older than the party, also supported that party. So they tend to lie. I mean, they're coming from that part of the party, which we know the vote share of that party apparently was never higher than 15%.
Thank you, first of all. I just had a question based on this exceptional effect of polarization in Turkey combined with media control, of course, and then economic rents. All of these motivations to vote in one polarized left or right or one of these parties. Is there something exceptional about the non-voter in Turkey? Would you say that, you know, if it's exceptional in so many of these ways, what motivates the non-voter? Is it disillusionment? Is it disinterest? Is there something particular about the traditional voter?
That we don't know. Mainly because there are very few non-voters in Turkey. So in the last presidential election, elections turnout rate was close to 90%.
Wow.
So in a sample of like 1,300 people, if you're lucky, that's 130 people, right? What we know from aggregated data, again, falling into the trap of ecological fallacy, most of those non-voters are actually closer to the opposition in Turkey. But some of them are real non-ideologues. I mean, if you use Commerce's terminology in 1964, right? I mean, these people actually do not have any preferences. They are disengaged by the increasing polarization. Some are basically intolerant to conflict in politics. And we actually see that from time to time. When the tension really escalates, as in the case of the 2018 presidential elections. Remember, President Erdogan and then CHP candidate Muharrem İnce actually accused of each other, right? Both of them accused the other of being a Fethullah Gülen organization supporter. They actually opened up cases. So such conflict, when it actually heightens, there is research by Ulbik and Funk in 1994 in the US that simply shows that, I mean, a lot of conflict-avoidant people in those cases actually are discouraged from politics. And we observed a similar thing because we were in the field collecting data at the time, and we saw some less stronger partisans actually saying that they would not turn out. So it's kind of interesting, but I mean that we don't have enough evidence to actually basically write a paper on that. I mean, it's both observational data, and as I said, I mean, there are very few individuals. What I can say is, if it rains, CHP voters don't vote. As in the case of the US, by the way. I mean, there's a paper that says Republicans should pray for rain because Democrats actually don't vote when it rains. The same thing applies to Turkey as well. So their partisan, I'll say, attachment probably is not as strong as the other camp's attachment.
I would like to ask, so thank you for your presentation. And I would like to ask a question about the voter population. I was thinking, so I assume a lot of like first-time voters are introduced into your studies every time. And how are these newcomers to the voter population treated once they are introduced to the population in general? Do they become a generalist, an ordinary part of the population, or do they come in with their particular behaviors? Like, is this something you encounter in your studies? I was wondering.
If you read Conda reports, right, the new voters are different.
Yeah.
They're not.
Mm-hmm.
How do I know? So I anticipated your question. So basically, this shows the Turkish voters. The data come from 40 surveys as part of Eurobarometers conducted in Turkey between 2005 and 2020. Okay, and I divided the respondents based on the American understanding of cohorts, and these are the Gen Z, right? These were basically the red one that you see here are the ones who were born between 1997 and 2012. So the moment they actually entered the electorate, they were actually much less polarized. But once they vote, they are as polarized as their parents. Okay? And over again. So Emre Erdoğan and Pınar Uyan Semerci, they actually have a lab called Turkuaz Lab at Bilgi University. They specifically focus on the youth attitudes, and they actually find the same things. I mean, these people are, we know, right? I mean, the youth is less likely to vote, but once they vote, they are as polarized as their older siblings or maybe their parents. And you actually can see that this red line is always there, right? I mean, among the other cohorts.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead. We have time, yeah.
I want to ask a question on candidates this time. So the graph you showed was quite staggering how people consider like the amount of candidates available to them, the more they got polarized. How would you describe the relationship between candidates as an entity, like the number of candidates versus the number of available parties? Is there like have they grown to be two distinct things on their own, or is there still somewhat of a correlation between them? I'm asking it because there's a big skew, and when people are only considering candidates when they're polarized.
So I can answer that question based on two studies. One I wrote based on the 2018 elections. So in a co-edited by Kalajoğlu and Charcoal that published last year from the University of Michigan Press, I actually showed the effective number of candidates and effective number of parties at the district level in the country. They are very highly correlated. The reason is these groups, right? I mean, that we now are more congruent with the partisan identities, the group identities are more, I'll say, more frequent in certain parts of the country. So there is a good amount of localization of electoral behavior in Turkey. You actually see that in the eastern and southeastern part, and you have been observing that in the electoral geography of Turkish elections. I mean, since 1990s, right? That is one thing. The second is based on an article written by Gary Cox from Harvard University with Amorim Neto. They seem to argue that the effective number of presidential candidates tends to affect the effective number of parties if the presidential and parliamentary elections are temporally proximate to each other. And with the 2017 referendum, the presidential and parliamentary elections are now held simultaneously, right, concurrently. And because of that, you see that the presidential nomination, the alliances for joint nomination of, say, Erdogan by the Nation's Action Party and Justice and Development Party, is now carried to the parliamentary elections in the form of the Cumhur Alliance, right, the People's Alliance. And you see these alliances being carried to the parliamentary election, which actually decreases the number of available, not the parties, but the party alliances, basically more or less similar to the number of presidential candidates. Think about that, right? Sinan Oğan, I mean, it was basically Ata İttifakı, right? I mean, by the Victory Party. Erdogan, which was basically the Cumhur İttifakı's People's Alliance's candidate, and Kılıçdaroğlu, as well as Muharrem İnce, who literally basically stepped out of the race, 3 days before the first one. So even the HDP and the Green Left and the Turkish Labour Party, İttifak, Emek ve Özgürlük İttifakı, right? They even stepped out of that, so that basically decreased the number of candidates to even lower than the number of alliances, which this, to the best of my understanding, actually supports this Amorim Neto and Cox's argument that they made in 1997.
Unless there is one last question, I think we can conclude today. So, thank you so much. Thank you very much.